Welcome to Spectral Shadows. This is the place where the stories don't just haunt your mind, they follow you into the dark. Before the whispers begin, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it? Midnight? Or closer to the hour when shadows move on their own? If you're brave enough to continue, prove it. Like this video, subscribe to Spectral Shadows and leave a comment with your time and location, so we'll know exactly where to find you. Now, let's open the door to tonight's nightmare. Story number 1. For a number of years, I was a camp counselor at an overnight camp in the Muskokas. I loved it more than any job I've ever had, despite the non-existent pay, annoying campers, long days and short nights, crappy food, etc. For one, I got to tell as many scary stories as I could sputter out. There was nothing better than hanging around a dying campfire with a bunch of junior high kids who were demanding the scariest, most blood-curdling tales I knew. And I told them all. The babysitter and the eerie clown statue, the driver and the creepy gas attendant, the woman and her licking dog. I saved my best stories for the overnight trips we made in Algonquin Park. For non-Canadians, it's a massive park in the middle of Ontario, spanning nearly 8,000 square kilometers, when days would be spent canoeing on pristine lakes, and nights would be spent around the fire, singing and making s'mores, and being as rowdy as the only people within miles could be. Once the kids had quieted down, I told them stories of a stalker in the woods with a face so horrifying it paralyzed all of its victims in fear. Or the group of campers who decided to spend a night across the lake from an abandoned, or was it, insane asylum. On this particular night, I'd finished up the tales, once again insisting that they were entirely true, and sent the campers to their tents. It had been an exhausting day, and none of the 6 kids were in any mood to stay up later. My fellow counselor had also decided to pack it in, leaving just me on a fallen log next to the dying fire. I took a deep breath of the cool, fresh, pine-scented air and looked out at the lake. The partial moon reflected off the glassy water, and on the other side, I could see towering cliffs going up several hundred feet. I considered whether we could canoe over, climb up a few dozen feet, and do some cliff jumping. I grinned. The camp director would have my head if we did that. If he found out, movement at the very top of the cliffs caught my eye. There was a small light bobbing along the peak. At first I thought it was a star, but it was larger and gave off a golden glow. It slowly moved back and forth in a small arc. As I sat up and watched it, another appeared next to it, bobbing along the top of the cliff. Then another, and a few more. My stomach dropped into my feet. I grabbed my bag and pulled my digital camera out, then focused it on the little glowing orbs and used the zoom function. I counted them, and then I counted again. Oh shit. In a flash, I was up and running to the tents. Hey guys, wake up. We gotta go. There was movement in the tents, and then I had 7 confused heads looking out at me. My co-counselor wore a mixture of concern and pure anger. I hate to do this, I continued, but the clouds are looking really threatening. There's a big rainstorm coming in. If we get caught in it, it's going to ruin our trip. Seriously? Laura, my co-counselor, asked. We're in the middle of the woods. Where would we go? I pulled a map and flashlight out of my bag. There's a ranger's station a few kilometers south of us. I traced the path with my finger. We can make it there in a few hours. The campers groaned. Can't we just go in the morning? No, I shouted, my voice echoing across the lake. I lowered it. Come on, let's get packed up and go. I'll tell you a story along the way. I smiled, though I could feel my lips quivering. It's my best one. That seemed to get them going, and within 10 minutes the tents were packed up, and we'd begun our trek into the deep woods, with small flashlights our only guide. When I was confident we were moving at a steady pace, I allowed myself to relax and began to tell my favorite campfire story. Centuries before the European settlers made their way into the country, it was inhabited by the First Nations people. They had made the trip from across Western Canada, following the migration patterns of large animals such as buffalo and bison. Eventually, they reached Ontario, at which point they split off into smaller groups of travelers, each searching for a section of land to call their own. Legend has it that one group, consisting of about 20 men, women, and children, had ventured through this very area in search of a place to call home. Though it wasn't even the end of October, the weather had made a turn for the worse, and as the group journeyed around the lake, a fierce blizzard hit. Within an hour, the group found themselves in blinding snow and below zero temperatures. The clothes they had on were made for the fall, not this sort of weather, and there weren't any Canada Goose jackets around back then, but they pressed on. They didn't have any other choice. Night was falling as they reached a cliff bluff, which towered over a cold, choppy lake. There was no stopping for this group. They'd die if they didn't make it past the cliffs. But with darkness setting in, and the snow falling even harder, visibility was almost non-existent. So one of the elders had an idea. Using the little kerosene they had left, he lit a lantern for each of the travelers and had them carry it in front of them. Not so that they could see the cliffs, but so they could see who was in front of them, allowing them to all follow each other across the narrow bluffs. With the strongest of the men leading the way, the group began to cross the cliffs. The freezing wet snow soaked every bone in their body. The harsh wind chilled any exposed skin and threatened to push them right off the rock. Their path was no more than a few feet wide and would have been slippery to even the best of hiking boots, let alone hand-fashioned moccasins. Slowly, painstakingly slowly, they made their way up the cliffs, praying that whatever lay on the other side could shelter them from the intensifying storm. They were about halfway up, hundreds of feet above the lake, though it was well out of their vision. In fact, all they could see in this blinding storm was the lantern in front of them, acting as a beacon to guide their steps. If the light moved up, they moved up. If it went down, they moved down. Each of the travelers was almost in a trance, caring about nothing but the glowing orb a few feet away. For the leader, though, there was no such luxury. He moved forward blindly, feeling along the cliff with his free arm, though his skin was so numb he could barely feel anything. As the path wound back again, he made a misstep and lost his footing, just as a gust of wind blasted his back. He desperately grasped for the hold, but his frozen fingers couldn't get anything. With a terrified scream, he slipped off the cliffs and fell into the icy black lake. The rest of the party didn't see him fall, of course. All they saw was his glowing orb dropping away from the bluff and disappearing into the darkness. There was no time to mourn. They continued on, but the storm was worsening. After another minute, one of the children, his body unable to withstand the cold, dropped away, his lantern glowing until the choppy waters put it out. Another, having seen this, lost his balance and fell. This pattern went on until there were just 5 people left, fumbling along in the darkness, following the light in front. As hard as they tried, the cliffs were unforgiving. The remaining men fell down to 4, then 3, then 2, and then there was just 1 left, who, legend says, cursed the earth as his legs slipped and he plunged hundreds of feet down, his lantern the last one to be extinguished. Of the 20 members who tried to overcome the cliffs, I finished. Not one of them survived. They say that sometimes, when the conditions are right, you can see the orbs along the cliff, symbols of the lost travelers who will never find their homes. As the story ended, leaving the campers in an eerie silence, I saw lights up ahead. A wave of relief poured over me. We picked up the pace and found the ranger's station bursting with activity, with a half-dozen people running around, loading up trucks, and shouting into radios. The wind was beginning to really pick up, and I heard thunder in the distance. "Hey, you kids!" A large, burly man with a full beard and mustache ran up to us. "Get in the trucks. We don't have much time." Laura and I led the kids to one of the pickup trucks. "What's going on?" I asked the man. "Didn't you hear?" Another gust of wind. Huge storm systems heading right for us. Already been tornadoes touched down. "We're getting everyone out of here. Let's go." We all climbed into the truck's bed. I collapsed down, feeling like I'd just been punched in the gut. The ranger climbed into the front, and we took off down a makeshift road. My head was spinning. It wasn't possible. "How?" Laura slid next to me, keeping her voice low. "How did you know we had to get out of there?" I looked over at her. My face felt empty of any blood. "I saw the lights." "What?" "No. No." She gasped, then caught herself. "How many?" I took a deep breath. 8. She looked around at all the campers who were now lying against each other, asleep despite the bumpy road. "That's all of us, my God." I nodded and leaned against her. Laura had heard the traveler's story before, and she knew that I'd left out a key bit of information. The lights were real, but they were never random. If they were shining, bobbing back and forth, swinging in a small arc, it was because they had a message, a warning. One light would shine for each person who was about to die. Story number 2. I need to write this down. I need to get it out of my head and into the world, because I feel like I'm going crazy, and because I need to warn people. I'm an experienced hiker. I'm not one of those weekend warriors who sticks to the paved, well-marked trails. I like the deep woods, the places where you can walk for a whole day and not see another soul. I had a long weekend, so I decided to tackle a remote trail in a state forest a few hours from my home. My plan was simple. Hike in about 5 or 6 miles, find a good spot, camp for the night, and hike out the next day. Standard stuff. The hike in was beautiful. The air was crisp. The sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. The late autumn sun cast long, golden shafts of light through the canopy. The only sounds were the crunch of my boots on the fallen leaves, the chatter of distant sparrows, and the wind whispering through the trees. This is why I do it. This feeling of absolute peace, of being completely disconnected from the noise of the world. After a few hours of steady hiking, I started looking for a place to make camp. I was looking for the usual, a relatively flat spot, not too close to the trail, preferably with access to a water source. And then, I found it. It wasn't just a good spot. It was a perfect spot. Unnaturally perfect. I stepped off the main trail, pushing through a thicket of ferns, and found myself in a clearing I can only describe as idyllic. It was a perfect circle, maybe 40 feet in diameter. The ground was covered in a carpet of short, soft, vibrant green grass that looked more like a meticulously manicured lawn than a patch of wild forest floor. And the trees formed a perfect, unbroken ring around the clearing. Tall, ancient oaks and pines stood shoulder to shoulder, their branches interlocking overhead. like some kind of dome, leaving this single, perfect circle of green open to the sky. It was like something out of a fairy tale. A small, rational part of my brain registered how strange it was. Clearings in dense forests are rarely so symmetrical. The grass shouldn't be so uniform, so soft. But the overwhelming feeling was one of discovery, of incredible luck. It felt safe, protected. The circle of trees felt like a natural fence, a private room gifted to me by the forest itself. I dismissed my unease as city dwellers' cynicism. I had found the jackpot of campsites. I dropped my pack with a contented sigh and set to work. The tent went up easily, the stakes sinking into the soft earth with a satisfying thump. I gathered some fallen branches from just outside the clearing and built a small, neat fire pit in the center. Soon, a cheerful little fire was crackling away, warding off the evening chill. I cooked a simple meal of dehydrated chili and sat on my log, watching the flames dance as the sun set, painting the sky above the circle of trees in hues of orange and purple. This, I thought to myself, is perfect. This is what it's all about. As true darkness fell, the forest changed, as it always does. The familiar woods of the day became a strange place of shadows and unseen movements, but I was snug in my little circle of light and warmth. I felt completely secure. After cleaning up my cook set, I doused the fire thoroughly, making sure every last ember was out, and crawled into my tent. I zipped up the flap, settled into my sleeping bag, and tried to sleep. And that's when the perfection started to unravel. It began with a feeling, a strange sensation from the ground beneath me. It was a faint, almost imperceptible movement, directly under my sleeping bag. It felt like insects, a whole lot of them, moving around just under the tent floor, a low-grade, creepy-crawly feeling. I tried to ignore it. I'm in the woods, after all. There are bugs. I pulled my sleeping bag tighter around me and closed my eyes, focusing on the gentle sounds of the night. But I couldn't sleep. The feeling persisted, a constant, subtle, wriggling sensation against my back. It wasn't painful. It was just wrong. Then the noises started. They came from outside the tent, from the ring of trees surrounding the clearing. A soft snap of a twig, the dry rustle of leaves. At first I assumed it was just an animal, a deer, maybe a raccoon, but the sounds were too regular. Snap, rustle, snap. They seemed to be moving slowly around the perimeter of the clearing, like someone was moving around me in the darkness. My heart started to beat a little faster. I lay there perfectly still, my ears straining in the darkness. And then I saw the shadows. My tent is made of thin, light-colored nylon. The moon was bright, and it cast eerie dancing shadows of the tree branches onto the tent walls. I watched them, trying to calm my racing mind. It's just the wind, I told myself. The wind is making the branches move. But there was no wind. The air was dead still. Yet the shadows on my tent walls were moving, not just swaying, but actively, deliberately shifting. They were long, thin, finger-like shadows, and they were stroking the outside of my tent. I could see them sliding up the walls, tracing the seams, like curious, probing fingers. I sat bolt upright, my breath caught in my throat. I grabbed my powerful flashlight from the mesh pocket beside me. My hand was shaking. I flicked it on, pointing the bright white beam at the tent wall. The shadow vanished in the glare. I swept the beam around the inside of the tent. Nothing. Just me, my gear, and my hammering heart. I turned the light off. The shadow fingers returned, caressing the thin fabric. I was terrified now. The feeling from the ground had intensified. It wasn't just a vague wriggling anymore. It was faster, more deliberate. It felt like 1,000 tiny needles tapping against the floor of the tent from underneath. I fumbled for the flashlight again, my hands slick with sweat, and pointed the beam down at the tent floor beside my sleeping bag. And I saw it. The grass had come through. Dozens of thin blade-like shoots of soft green grass had pierced the thick nylon floor of my tent. They were sticking up, maybe half an inch, like a patch of freshly sprouted lawn. But that wasn't the worst part. They were moving. They were swaying back and forth in perfect, horrifying unison. Swish, swish, swish. A tiny, hypnotic, rhythmic motion. They weren't just blades of grass. They were something else. Cilia, teeth, feelers. They were testing the air inside my tent. They were trying to find me. I screamed, then scrambled for the zipper of the tent door, my fingers feeling like useless, clumsy sausages. The sound of the zipper was obscenely loud in the silence. I burst out of the tent and stumbled to my feet in the center of the clearing, whipping the beam of my flashlight around wildly. The clearing was empty. The circle of trees stood silent and still. For a moment, a sliver of hope, of denial, cut through my panic. Maybe I was hallucinating. Maybe I had finally lost it. Then I turned the flashlight back on my tent, and the world fell out from under me. The tree branches weren't coming from the trees. They were coming from the ground. Dozens of thick, dark, root-like tendrils, the color of wet earth, had erupted from the soft green grass of the clearing. They were wrapped around my tent, constricting it, squeezing it like a giant boa constrictor. The sleek dome of my tent was misshapen, buckled inwards under the pressure. The roots were fibrous and sinewy, and I could swear I saw them pulsing with a slow, rhythmic beat, like a network of dark veins. They were pulling the tent downwards, into the soft earth, which seemed to be yielding, sinking. It looked like my tent was being eaten, digested, and in that moment of absolute soul-shattering horror, I understood. I didn't think. I didn't grab my pack. I didn't try to save my expensive gear. My phone, my wallet, they were all in the tent. A tent that was currently being swallowed by the ground. The only thing I had was the flashlight in my hand, and the clothes on my back. I ran. I ran for the gap in the trees that led back to the trail, my feet pounding on the soft, living earth. I felt a strange, sucking sensation with every step, as if the ground itself was trying to hold me back. I crashed through the ferns and onto the hard-packed dirt of the trail, and I didn't stop. The run through the forest was a blur of pure, animal panic. The beam of my flashlight bounced and jittered, illuminating a chaotic, terrifying slideshow of dark tree trunks, twisted roots, and gaping black shadows. Every rustle of leaves was the creature, its tendrils slithering after me. Every shadow was its gaping maw. I ran until my lungs felt like they were on fire, until my legs were jelly, until I was sobbing and gasping for air. After what felt like an eternity, I saw it, a glint of reflected light through the trees. My car. The sight of that familiar man-made object was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I burst out of the woods and into the small gravel parking area, fumbling in my pocket for the spare key I always keep there. My hands were shaking so violently, it took me 3 tries to get it into the lock. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and locked it. I sat there for a moment, my chest heaving, listening to the sound of my own ragged breathing. I jammed the key in the ignition, and the engine roared to life. A beautiful, beautiful sound of civilization and escape. I didn't look back. I drove all night, the adrenaline coursing through my veins, not stopping until the sun was up and I was hundreds of miles away. I'm safe now, I guess. I'm in a cheap motel room, but I'm not okay. I close my eyes and I see it. The wiggling grass, the pulsing dark roots, the way my tent buckled and sank into the earth. I think the clearing wasn't a clearing. It was a thing, a living thing. The soft grass wasn't grass. It was a lure, the soft lining of a mouth. The perfect circle of trees wasn't a protective fence. It was the rim of the jaw, and I had willingly, happily, set up my camp on its tongue. Story number 3. Camping always has the potential to be kind of creepy. I love it, being alone in the middle of nowhere, with nothing but a tent between me and the elements. I find it incredibly refreshing to get away from the rest of humanity like that. Yet I would be the first to admit that in being so isolated, it is easy to go from calm and relaxed to panicked and expecting death, with nothing more than the sound of a twig snapping unexpectedly. But it is worth it, and I take all the safety precautions I can. My family knows my travel plans, up-to-date maps. I check in via satellite phone regularly, hire a recently serviced vehicle, spare wheels, spare fuel, spare water, and all the rest. Plus, I have enough medical supplies to start a small hospital. I also do a whole lot of research, so I know the area, mostly the weather, the politics, and the local flora and fauna. I was traveling to snake and spider-infested Australia, so that last one was of particularly high priority for the trip. I make a bit of money as a freelance nature photographer, so I was hoping the spring season would get me some good shots of wildlife. But despite feeling pretty organized, despite never having had any major problems while camping in the past, there is one more thing I will never neglect looking into again. Local folklore. Right, yeah. Laugh if you want, but let me tell you about my time camping in the Australian outback. It had been a rough day of driving. I felt like every one of my joints was compressed from the Land Rover bouncing over the rough corrugated tracks. And the weather had been particularly hot and dry, even more than usual, 4 days into my 2-week trek across the desert, and I was sunburnt, blistered, and covered in little bites from gnats and mosquitoes, which no amounts of sunscreen or insect repellent seemed to protect against, respectively. I considered it all worth it, though. The landscape is spectacular, like nothing I had ever seen before. When I stopped for lunch, there were panoramic views of red-earthed land so flat you could see for miles uninterrupted, but for low-growing grasses and the occasional silvery paperbark tree, I could make out one distant peak. It definitely wasn't a mountain. I would even hesitate to say hill. It must have been less than 500 feet high, but it stood out in the otherwise flat landscape. I decided to drive towards it and camp nearby, as I could try getting normal phone reception from the top as well as take some photos of the desert at sunset. I arrived at its base. It was late in the afternoon, so I set up my tent on the flat, hard soil before gathering my gear to climb the hill. It was relatively easy to scramble up. I had changed into trousers before leaving, despite the heat, because the temperature always dropped so suddenly in the desert. I was grateful for this later, as my knees were somewhat protected as I hauled myself over rocks and through thorny bushes. My hands were stained the same bright red of the soil by the time I neared the top, and I suspected the rest of me was too. I could even feel the grit permeating my mouth. There was no regular reception, but I wasn't worried. I still had the satellite phone if I needed it. The top made for a great vantage point for pictures, but the sun was still a little while off that beautiful dusky lighting, so I had a look around. The hill was mostly barren rock, but small determined shrubs found room to grow, albeit withered and stunted, in the slightest of cracks. On the far side, I discovered a small hollow of a cave. It was narrow at the mouth, but rapidly got wider further in. I yelled and stomped in an attempt to ascertain if there was any wildlife lurking, but there was no sound in response. Crouching down, I shuffled in. It smelled sour and like rotting meat. My boots knocked against something solid, which clattered away like dropped cutlery. Clicking on my torch, I saw it was a pile of bones, ranging vastly in size. They looked recent and were not entirely devoid of flesh. Disgusted, I covered my mouth and nose with my hand and quickly swung the light around to assure myself I was alone. Native wild dogs, I suspected. Dingoes, nocturnal, and already out hunting for the night. There were bones scattered throughout the cave, sometimes at random, sometimes in little piles, as well as partially eaten animal carcasses. Small mammals mostly, and the better part of a big roo. Slight depressions and hollows in the dust indicated where the animals must lay. I didn't linger, knowing my scent would already cause the dingoes some consternation when they returned. Although like any wild dogs, I knew dingoes could be vicious. I wasn't worried camping so close. They looked very well fed, and they weren't the type of animal to pick fights with humans unprompted. Outside, I got a couple of shots of a wedge-tail eagle before it flew quickly east, and eventually shots of the sun setting over the desert plains. I had expected to see more wildlife. This was the least populated part of the desert so far. Apart from the carcass in the cave, I hadn't seen any mobs of kangaroos nor a common bustard bird all day. Not good for photography. It seemed that here, even the flies and ants weren't pestering me. It was peaceful, lying back on a rock, watching the stars emerge one by one, and knowing I was the only human for hundreds of miles. Desolate, nearly uninhabitable expanses of wilderness in every direction make you feel like you are on another planet. It can make me uneasy at times, but mostly it feels liberating to be so isolated, and I was happy. Eventually, I had to climb down before I lost all visibility. Night had fallen like a blanket, painting the luminous landscape in shades of gray and navy. I had left an electric lantern on at my table at camp, so with no obstructions on the plain, it was easy to get back to the car in the dark. But as I walked, occasionally losing my footing on loose stones or in burrows of animals, I saw the lantern fall from the table in the distance. No, it didn't fall. It arced upwards before falling to the ground, the light going dim. Those things are heavy and hardy. It would be difficult for the wind to knock it over, let alone pick it up and drop it with force enough to break it. I stood, poised in the dark. It wasn't pitch black. The light from the stars and the sliver of a moon illuminated the outline of the car, glinted off the metal fastenings of the tent. Behind me, the hill was a dark mass of looming, impenetrable shadows. I picked up the pace, jogging as carefully as I could. I considered waving my arms, yelling, shining my torch. Anything to try and frighten away any dingoes that might be lingering. But I didn't really want to aggravate them. Besides, I couldn't see any sign of movement in the campsite. This was confirmed when I arrived. Apart from the lantern, nothing was disturbed. But the lantern, it looked like it had been crushed underfoot, but it would have taken a massive amount of weight to achieve that. A second later, I nearly jumped out of my skin when in the distance the most bone-chilling sound I have ever heard reverberated through the night. High-pitched, undulating cries, rising and falling in a mass chorus. I was already jittery, so it took me a second to realize it must be dingoes howling, but they sounded so distant, when surely they had been in my campsite only moments before. Nothing could move that fast. The cold, still night air carried the calls from what sounded like miles away. Hairs stood up on the back of my neck and the long howls only added to my growing anxiety. I did several things then. I made sure I had my car keys in my pocket, and I dragged my sleeping bag out of the tent and made room for it on the back seat to sleep there. At least the car would block out the sound of the dogs better than a tent. Then I climbed onto the roof of the car and adjusted the spotlight I had attached. It was good for providing emergency light, and I often used it to look for animal eyes at night near my camp. Usually I enjoyed this interaction with nature, but that night I was already nervous. With some trepidation, I moved the beam of light around the clearing, straining my eyes for any glint of reflection that would indicate the presence of another creature. I thought there was nothing, but the very top of the light caught something so briefly I wondered if I had imagined it. I swung the beam higher and higher, beyond the height of a dingo, far beyond even the height of a human. And I saw it again, 2 milky white, perfectly round dots in the dark. I was frozen stiff with shock until they tilted suddenly. I jumped, the spotlight jerking to one side with me, where I saw more of the eyes. These ones close enough I could make out shadowed, impossibly lanky, humanoid frames with elongated limbs. With the light on them, they too jerked their heads as though to look at me, eyes glinting white and luminescent like pearls. I turned the light off instantly. It was stupid, but all I could think was that I didn't want to see them anymore. The darkness embraced me even more thoroughly now that my eyes had grown accustomed to such bright light. I blinked, desperately trying to discern any movement nearby, while simultaneously dreading seeing anything at all. In the distance, the howls cut off abruptly. Now my own ragged breathing was the only sound. Strange, when usually the nights here were hosted choirs of insects chirping. With a sudden rush of adrenaline and an instinct warning me to move, I pitched myself from the roof of the car. I didn't climb. I threw myself off, hit the ground hard on one shoulder, staggered upright, and started fumbling for my keys. I heard a rumbling sound, deep and building like an avalanche, and realized that the ground was shaking. Wrenching open the door, I heard ripping nearby. I didn't have to turn around to know it was my tent being shredded. With my lungs straining, heart pounding, and the contents of my stomach doing a roiling impersonation of the Spanish Armada, I jammed the key into the ignition. The engine stuttered to life. The headlights blinked on. There was nothing in front of the car. My relief didn't last. An immense scraping sound came from the back of the Land Rover. Then the twisting shriek of metal being mutilated. I yanked at the gearbox, fumbling to get the car into drive, while simultaneously looking in the rearview mirror. I couldn't see anything past the luggage I had piled up to the roof in the boot, but the scraping at the back of the vehicle continued, like something was trying to claw its way inside. When I heard the sound of glass smashing, I finally slammed my foot onto the accelerator and began to hurtle back in the direction I had come that day. It wasn't long before I nearly rolled the car as the right-hand side dipped into a dry creek bed at high speed. I swerved, by some luck managing to regain control, and slowed my pace considerably. Never had I had to exert more self-control. Every instinct was telling me to keep moving as fast as possible, but my more rational side knew getting out in one piece was more important. Every time I glanced into the side mirrors, I expected to see something in pursuit. I drove through the night, hands gripping the wheel like vices, jumping at the silhouette of every tree. As the light of dawn broke and my breath puffed up in clouds in the morning chill, I saw what I had been looking for. A fence indicating a nearby cattle station I had stopped at to refill my water the previous morning. I drove up to the property. The owner was bundled up in a woolen jumper, leaning back on the veranda steps, hot coffee in hand. He watched me approach, bemused, but leapt up to help me when I all but fell out of the car. Once he had ascertained that I wasn't actually injured, he sat me down at his kitchen table, spooned instant coffee into a second mug, and reboiled the kettle without any further questions. Eventually, I spoke. Something strange happened to me last night. Yeah, I was taken aback by his response. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an assumption. It was just casual acceptance. You strayed west. Maybe, I don't know, the track wasn't distinct. Nah, you did for sure. Quincan territory. Excuse me, what territory? I'd already encountered my fair share of Australian sarcasm in my trip, so I wasn't 100% certain I wasn't being teased. My people don't go there, haven't for thousands of years. Quincan spirits, too much mischief. He shrugged. I saw these things. Like humans, but tall, thin. He was nodding, unperturbed. I still felt so shaken, the echoes of the metal ripping ringing in my ears. He passed me a coffee and left the room. A little while later, when my coffee was almost gone, he came back with a photo of some cave paintings. Something like that, you're right, I told him. I couldn't believe I was actually having this conversation. Speaking of caves, I found a dingo cave too, on a hill, full of dead animals. Animals? Bones, yeah. No, bits of rue and the likes. Dingoes wouldn't leave meat on a carcass. I shifted uncomfortably in my chair, unsure of how to reply. Thanks for the coffee. I should probably check the damage to the car and get going. Damage? Yep. I reckon one of those krakens or whatever had a go at my tent and the rover. Something scared me half to death anyhow. Quincan, he corrected automatically, then went silent. He watched me carefully for a minute before picking up the empty mugs and putting them on the sink. He ran a hand through his curly dark hair and then shook his head. Doesn't sound like them. They good spirits. They might have been trying to warn you. Warn me about what? I asked, after hesitating to decide whether I really wanted to know after all. Turamuli, I reckon. He's like 'em, but different. He cleared his throat. My grandfather said, when the ground shakes and animals flee, you know Turamuli is near. You're one lucky fella that he was more interested in the tent than you. He ran a hand deftly over the claw marks gouged in the car. It was shocking how small his fingers looked in the breadth of the gash. What is... He cut me off, putting a hand on my shoulder, looked me dead in the eye, expression serious as a heart attack. I'd reckon he's got your scent, though. You should get a move on, mate. I decided not to ask any more questions. I left immediately and kept driving back the original way I had come until I intersected a highway. From there, I went to the nearest city, booked a plane flight, and cut my trip short. The local indigenous people knew something about that hill, knowledge that saw them, and even their ancestors today, giving that place a wide berth. Who better to learn the dangers of the land from than those who lived from it? Next time I camp, I will be more mindful of ancient warnings, and I would recommend you do the same. You've reached the end, but the shadows haven't left you. If this story unsettled you, prove you survived. Like this video, subscribe to Spectral Shadows, and leave a comment with the part that haunted you most. The darkness is always waiting, and so are we. Until next time, don't turn off the lights.